Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.
And joining us today is the courageous and hilarious Harry Miller, ex-police officer and founder of Fair Cop. Fair Cop is a group of gender-critical lawyers, police officers, writers and professionals in removing politics from policing. I like that, removing politics from policing. You're very welcome, Harry Miller.
Thank you for having a Protestant heretic on here. As a Baptist, I've dried myself off, and I'm ready to speak to you, good people. It's absolutely lovely.
Speak to a couple of Catholics. Thank you.
I'm not sure who's afraid of who most, Harry, but we'll try and find enough courage to talk to each other.
Yeah, excellent.
Thanks for joining us. I introduced you with two adjectives. I thought, what two adjectives can I use? Courage is definitely up there, and we'll come to why courage in a moment. But I wanted to say hilarious because anyone who's read your articles, Harry, knows how amusing they are. You've got a real ability to puncture the hypocrisy through your written word. And actually, you say some very powerful things, but in a humorous way. And a bit like the boy who cried, "The Emperor's got no clothes." You're able to reveal truth in the way you write. So I would encourage everyone to read the articles that Harry writes. They're both amusing and informative. And then we'll come to courage. So the reason I introduced you as courageous is because you're an ex-police officer, as I mentioned, Harry, and you yourself found yourself on the wrong side of the law because of a tweet. I think it was one tweet in particular, if I'm right. Correct me at any point if I'm wrong, which I must say I found hilarious, which was, "I was assigned mammal at birth, but my orientation is fish. Don't misspecies me." Very funny, but it got you into a lot of trouble, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. So first things first, I am technically an ex-police officer, but it was a long time ago. Since leaving the police in the early 90s, I've been primarily a businessman running a fairly large business at the Port of Immingham. And alongside that, I was lecturing at universities in MBA, in business, in leadership, management, and all that sort of stuff. I was absolutely a nobody as far as the Twitter sphere were concerned up until about, January 2019. During 2018, my wife had encouraged me to tweet about the increasing creep of trans activism on the rights of, not only on the rights of women, but on our understanding of language, on our understanding of biology, etc. And she said, "Look, Harry, the thing is, unless men speak out, people aren't going to listen." So, as the dutiful husband, I did as I was told and began tweeting in my fairly sardonic way. And as you rightly point out, I said, I was assigned mammal at birth, but I identify as fish. Don't misspecies me. Then I used a naughty word, but there we go. Typically, I would get absolutely no interaction whatsoever. If anybody liked my tweet, that would be like a red letter day. If anybody retweeted my tweet, it was like, "Whoa, look at me." I was an absolute nobody. I had less than 1,000 followers, and I was universally ignored. It was quite amazing until one day I got a phone call from work. I was out of the office at the time, down at Tesco's, enough. And my managing director, it's my business, so the managing director was, he was appointed by me. He said, "Harry, we've had the police here. They want to talk to you." Now I thought, oh, that's interesting. And now I ran at the time quite a dangerous company. We operated in shipping and machinery, and so there's any number of things that could have gone on that the police might want to speak to me about. What I wasn't expecting was when I phoned the police officer, the first thing out of his mouth was, "Are you Harry the Owl on Twitter?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am Harry the Owl on Twitter." And he said, "Right, well, there's been a complaint." I said, "Right, what about?" And he said, "Well, there's been a complaint that your Twitter views make your workplace unsafe for trans people." At which point I sort of stopped and laughed. Because if you know anything about the Port of Immingham, it is a backwater. I don't think we've yet had the Reformation in Immingham. The people of Immingham still point upwards when a plane goes over and point. It's that sort of place. It's not the kind of place that you would think of as being a hive of transgender activity. Nevertheless, I have a very good record with my employees. We've never once been taken to court with the Equality Act or the acts that preceded it. We've never once been challenged about the Equality Act or the acts that preceded it. So this came as a huge amount of news to me. And considering that we were employing up to 100 people at a time, you would have thought that over many, many years, if my place had been unsafe for trans people, somebody might have mentioned it, but they didn't. Anyway, this is where my knowledge as an ex-policeman kicked in, and I said, "Now hold on a minute." I said, "Is anything that I've tweeted against the law?" And he said, "Oh no." I said, "Well, in that case, why are you ringing me?" And he said, "I need to check your thinking." That was literally what he said. And I said, "Okay, so let me get this straight. I haven't broken any laws." He said, "No." "You're a police officer?" He said, "Yes." "And you want to check my thinking?" He said, "That's right." I said, "Have you any idea what that makes you?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Right, George Orwell's 1984. It is a dystopian novel, not a police how-to manual." And he'd never heard of 1984. He'd never heard of George Orwell. So all that went completely over his head. So we had a bit of a discussion. And I said, "Right then, so give me an example of something that I've tweeted that's not criminal, but it's almost criminal. Give me your best shot. What's the thing that I said that was almost criminal?" And he said, "You tweeted a limerick." I said, "I don't think I did. I don't think I've ever tweeted a limerick in my life." He said, "Oh yeah, we've got one here." Anyhow, it turns out that I'd retweeted a feminist limerick. It wasn't a feminist lyric. It wasn't a limerick at all. Maybe identified as a limerick. I don't know. But it certainly was not a limerick. And all it said was a few home truths that, talking of trans people, it said, what was it? Your breasts are made of silicon, your vagina goes nowhere, and we can tell the difference even when you're not there. Your hormones are synthetic. Now let's just cross this bridge. What you have, you foolish man, is male privilege. That was it. It was a pretty poor feminist lyric, but I wasn't the author of it. I was simply someone who retweeted it. And he told me that because I'd retweeted it, I had endorsed the sentiments therein, and that I was spreading hate. And as a result of this, I would be on a thing called a non-crime hate record. I had committed a non-crime hate incident. And furthermore, this non-crime hate incident didn't need any evidence of hate. It just needed somebody to perceive that my actions had been hateful. It gets worse than that. Once we dug into the so-called non-crime hate incidents, so we discovered that these had been put in place from since 2014. The 2014 College of Policing issue of the hate crime guidance. So where somebody had not committed a crime, but nevertheless it was perceived by the victim or anybody else that the motivation was hateful, that was it. You were recorded as a hater. It gets even worse. Turns out that there were something like 125,000 people with non-crime hate incidents against their name between 2014 and 2019. And it gets even worse because the police told us that if you had a non-crime hate incident against your name, it could be revealed on an enhanced DBS check to a potential future or current employer. That's how serious these non-crime hate incidents was. So what we did is we took the police to the High Court. We took the Chief Constable of Humberside to the High Court. His defence was that he was following the guidance set out by the College of Policing. So we took the College of Policing to the High Court as well. Now, in a quite bizarre ruling, the presiding judge, Mr. Justice Knowles, ruled that Humberside Police had behaved like the Stasi, the Cheka, and the Gestapo, but the guidance that they had followed, which had asked them to behave in that way, was lawful. So their actions were unlawful, but the guidance itself was lawful. We said that is fundamentally not logical. That makes no sense at all. So we went to the Court of Appeal the following year, and we won that, and we got the hate crime guidance struck down and brand new statutory guidance put in its place. So hate crime, non-crime hate incidents can still occur, but there is now a burden of proof that the police have to satisfy. It's not absolute proof. They don't have to prove a crime, but they've got to prove something more than somebody's perception of offence. And we're technically speaking quite happy with that position, because let's face it, we do want our police to be collecting information that might be useful before a crime occurs. That seems to be perfectly reasonable. But what we don't want is them collecting information on people simply because they've expressed a view which the police don't like. That, we say, is a clear infringement of Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. It's an interference with our freedom of speech, and we took it to court, and it's pronounced to be entirely unlawful. So, boom, that's been in
Goodness me. I think one of the reasons we wanted to speak with you is because we can see the way in which there's going to be an increasing clash between our Christian faith and expressing our beliefs about human sexuality and the givenness of our sex. We must be free to be able to speak those truths. What you've spoken about here with the non-crime hate incident is the idea that it's about a perception. We just seem to be sneaking into this world of unreality, being able to identify as something that you are not, and then saying, because you've offended me so much, and I perceive that you've offended me, irrespective of your motive. It's really frightening stuff. How do you think we've got to this point? You've been a police officer, you see how the police operate now. How did we make this move such that a police officer could turn up on your doorstep and say, I'm coming to investigate your thinking?
Tony Blair started it.
I think you're absolutely right. I think Tony Blair did start it. So that was sort of 1997 when the whole diversity inclusion thing started coming in, and open borders and World Economic Forum and all that sort of stuff. That's where the philosophy began to take root in the United Kingdom.
Harry, there was a point with New Labour's legislation where the old legal test, what would the man on the Clapham omnibus think, which was a form of corporate objectivity, was replaced by subjectivity. If a person thinks that crimes happen to them,
that's right.
Then it's happened.
Part of that was because I think you've got Tony Blair, then you've got the Macpherson report. Now, what the Macpherson report did, it addressed what it called institutional police racism, where the police at the time in the Met tended to see black communities as perpetrators, not as victims. And if they claimed victimhood, it tended to be ignored or not treated in quite the same way that if you were a white middle class person, for instance, might be treated. So Macpherson was correct to point out a few home truths about policing at that time. Unfortunately, what happened was the police ended up with a massive burden of guilt, a huge burden of guilt, which they've been trying to run from and escape from and shed ever since. Now, because much of what Macpherson talks about was perception, the police have gone overboard, and rather than taking into account a person's perception, just as one of the many factors that they need to take into account, perception was given preeminence, so that by the time 2014 comes along and we've got the College of Policing hate crime guidance, it literally says in order to record a non-crime hate incident, all it requires is the perception of the victim or any other person, so a third-party observer, and then it said that no evidence of hate is required. That's what it said. No evidence of the hate element is required, and it must be recorded. So what this does, it elevates perception, not to the rank of being of equal importance or near importance with objective evidence, but it trumps objective evidence. And then the College of Policing also put in a safeguard. They said that any police officer who questions the rationality of a claim of perception, they themselves are committing a secondary hate incident. So the College of Policing got the police between a rock and a hard place. And it was only when they came knocking at my door that they literally came up against the wrong guy. I remember Toby Young of the Free Speech Union doing a fantastic headline calling me the wrong guy, because of all the people in all the world they could come knocking on, I was absolutely the wrong person for that to have happened, because there are so few people in the country who have, one, the bloody mindedness that I've got, and the sense of righteousness and injustice. But two, because I ran my own business, I didn't have anybody in the HR department telling me what I could do. And thirdly, because I'm an ex-police officer, I have a very clear sense of what constitutes a crime. And I've got a very clear understanding that it's not the role of the police to get involved in things which are not crimes. You know, once you understand the basis upon which our criminal justice system is set, and you understand that we in the UK are very different from across the water in Europe, in that there is a presumption of freedom in our country. We are free to say, to act, to do, to think whatever we want to, right up until a very specific point that the government says this far and no further. In that sense, it differs very much from the European model, which is a Napoleonic model of permission. The state gives you permission to say, to think, to speak, to do. It's a very, very different system. And unfortunately, the police have been operating a Napoleonic system rather than our common law British system. And it took me, basically, to point this out to them and to be in the position where I was blessed with enough money not to worry, with enough autonomy not to worry, and with the right kind of nature that doesn't mind going into a long battle that is going to be hard fought and that has a very, very unpredictable outcome. So in all senses, they picked on the wrong guy, which is why I've now got the wrong guy written on my arm in a tattoo. There we go.
I mean, Harry, it was a fantastic victory to get rid of the non-crime hate incident, and without it, so many people would have been put effectively on a blacklist that many of them didn't even know about, as you quite rightly pointed out. But we're not out of the woods yet, are we? Because there are still hate crimes. They still check our thinking. And one of the things, I mean, we haven't yet had to face this appalling blasphemy crime of the new definition of Islamophobia that so many councils have taken up and the Labour government wants to turn into law. But nonetheless, even with racism, there's still, our presumption of innocence has evaporated, and there's a presumption of guilt operating, because you just need to accuse somebody of racism or the thought crime, and you can't prove that there isn't any, because subjectivity, and particularly subjectivity of the victim, takes precedence. So we're still in trouble, aren't we?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you think about it, again, a crime is mens rea plus actus reus minus the defence. There's got to be a conscious guilty mind. But you get round that by saying, your conscious mind may not have been guilty of it. That's
but your unconscious mind.
That's your unconscious bias, because it's your unconscious bias, your unconscious phobia, transphobia, racism, etc., which are motivating you to do these actions and say these things. So whilst it's not quite a crime, maybe not quite a crime, you're still responsible for it because it's your unconscious bias. And if you refuse to go on the training, then you then become even more culpable. So that's the position that we're in. There is an assumption of guilt. There is an assumption that certainly if you're male, if you're white, and if you're Christian, you need to do an awful lot of work upon yourself to even get to the starting blocks of being an acceptable person in this post-Blairite world that we live in. Because you
Harry,
need to check our thinking.
Help me out a little bit. I'm pedantic, and because I studied law once, I think I know everything, which is desperately dangerous and bad position to be in. I keep on wanting to say in public, there is no definition of racism. I mean, racism, there just isn't. There's no scientific definition of racism, and there's no way of getting inside someone's mind to know what level of antipathy they do or don't attach to dermatological sliding scales. But of course, nobody pays any attention to that, because although I may be technically right, it's so counter-cultural, it doesn't have any traction at all. And racism has become the catch-all thought crime, even to the extent of, if you accept the nonsense of white privilege, of making all white people guilty, especially all white men guilty, just as a matter of social and historical fact. Part of this has to do with the Equalities Law, which embedded it. But there's nothing actually we can do, is there? If the police come and knock on our door and say, we have some people who tell us that they're offended, whether they're trans people or not, or whether they're dark-skinned people instead, or even yellow-skinned people, there is no defence against the crime of racism or stirring up racial hatred, is there?
It depends whether you've committed a crime. Again, a crime has to have three elements. Mens rea, that's the guilty mind. Actus reus, which is the action, and no defence. So it depends what you've said. If you've been down to the corner shop and started screaming "Paki" at somebody, then you probably are a racist and you probably are guilty of some form of offence. But you cannot intuit somebody's motivation. You cannot intuit it, and that's the problem. The police are now intuiting what our motivations are. Keir Starmer, this last fortnight, what a genius he is, because he's able to intuit an entire section of the population, and he knows their politics. He calls them far-right thugs. Now, let's compare and contrast with how he approached the motivation of the Black Lives Matter rioters just a few years ago. To be fair to Sir Keir, he did condemn their actions, but then he did not condemn their motivation. He did not consider them alt-left thugs. He didn't consider them far socialist thugs. He said that whilst they had a point, they went about making their point in the wrong way. I'm sorry, that's not good enough. And then he did further. He then adopted the symbol of the rioters by taking the knee.
Yeah.
He then specifically told police officers that they should be allowed to take the knee if their conscience so dictated. And then when his own party criticised him for that mild criticism, what he did was he promised that he would go on an anti-unconscious bias course so that he could have his internal thinkings checked. That is the difference in approaches. Keir Starmer looked at the Black Lives Matters and thought they're doing the right thing in the wrong way. He's looked at what's going on now, and he just knows that these are all evil Tommy Robinson types who want nothing more than to kill a pack. That's the way it is. That's what he's got in his head. Now, let's just have a little think about his background. He's a former director of public prosecutions. Okay, now if your job is prosecuting, there is no room for nuance. It's not your job to fact find. It's your job to prosecute. And in order to prosecute, you've got to prove that the other side have a guilty mind. You've got to prove that the other side have a guilty action. And you've got to prove that the other side don't have any legitimate defence. And that is precisely what he's doing with large sections of the public right now. He's treating great swathes of the public as defendants that he must prosecute. So he's not allowing them an inch of good faith. He's not allowing them an inch of a defence. He's saying, I know your motivation. You're a right-wing thug. Couple that with the action. There is no defence. You're all guilty. We're going to fast-track you through the system, and you're going to be in prison by the end of the week. Fortnight at the most. That's because he is the former director of public prosecutions. That's what's going on. I don't think he's that interested in truth. I don't think he's that interested in getting a consensus of opinion. I think his mindset is once he's decided that one side is guilty and need prosecuting. No, even before that, once he decided that one side needs prosecuting, he then has to reverse engineer that to show that they are guilty and that they have no defence. And I think he had a lot of sympathy with the Black Lives Matter protest. And I think some of that was personal sympathy. But then remember, that happened during a period. It was post Corbyn, but he still had an awful lot of people in his party who he was relying on to keep him as leader and support him to have a run at the Premiership. He needed to keep them on side. So at that point, he switched from his prosecutor persona to his political persona. I think that's what's happening there.
Oh, I see exactly what you mean. Yes, I see that clearly. I think you've hit on something really significant that's at the root of a lot of this, which is this I suppose critical theory has so infected everything in our culture, in education. My background is education, yours is policing, and I know in schools how hard they're driving this DEI, EDI, whatever you want to call it, equality, diversity, in inclusivity agenda, and they're ripping up curriculums and rewriting them and saying we can't deal with these issues because if we do, we'll be racist because this is how people behave in certain cultures. And by doing that, they're actually creating greater division and fostering difference and not unifying people. So I can see in schools that this is happening. It's, in a sense, it's very difficult because we're looking at it outside without, I suppose, being infected by those ideas. But presumably the police have had to go through training. Young people are coming out of schools having been fed all this and going into academies and training to be professionals and going into the corporate workplace. So it's hard to see that it is going to get better. And under a Labour government, it seems likely that part of the problem is talking past each other. It's just suddenly you've got a whole group of people who simply don't see it because they've been convinced through everything around them in the culture that there is no objective truth. We are guilty. We carry historic guilt, that we've got unconscious bias that we're not aware of. All of this stuff is so pervasive that then the people who've been fed it start to make decisions for our country, and then it impacts us.
Well, I think it's almost a perversion of the doctrine of original sin. We do carry with us as a species a certain amount of sin. That's biblical, but it's not this. It's not unconscious bias. It's not historical ancestral based racism. It's none of these things. What they've done, they've taken a truth and they've perverted it. They've turned it into something that it was not. It's as simple as that, as far as I can say. And the other thing is, what we've done as a generation is we've traded in critical thinking for critical theory.
Yeah,
that's it. We've traded in the capacity to critically think. We have lost. When I was teaching, even master students, who the number one thing about being a master student is that you should be able to think critically. But even then, I would be asked questions like, what's the right answer? What's the right answer? I said, look, business is not maths. Business isn't science. Go and make an argument. When you write an assignment, make an argument. And if you make your argument well enough, it'll get a great mark. Yeah, but what's the right argument? No, it's your job. Go and think critically. So we've traded in the capacity for critical thinking. And what we've done, we've embraced critical theory. And critical theory, of course, encompasses critical race theory. It encompasses critical sexual theory, critical gender theory. They're all different heads of the same hydra. And what it does, it makes everybody seek victim status. Because since 2010, the Equalities Act, if you can make yourself out to be a victim, it gives you a certain standing in the community that you wouldn't otherwise have. It gives you privileges you wouldn't have otherwise had. And it gives you protections that you otherwise wouldn't have had. And therefore, people are hunting left, right, and centre to see if they can find a little bit of something that they can say, that's protected by the Equality Act. Now, of course, the one thing that is not protected by the Equality Act, and which should have been protected by the Equality Act, is women. Sex is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, but when the police issued their hate crime guidance, they weren't happy with the 9 protected characteristics as set out by the Equality Act. They said, no, that's no good. We're going to do our own. And they came up with 5 monitored strands. And of course, sex wasn't one of them. Even though 2 women a week are murdered in this country. Even though we can make a very strong argument that misogynistic language, misogynistic action is one of the causes of misogynistic violence and misogynistic murder, the College of Policing at the time chose to ignore the plight of women and instead adopt the confected plight of trans women. So if you're a woman, no special protection. If you're a man claiming to be a woman, all the protection in the world. Now that's just perverse. Absolutely perverse.
It is perverse. Well, from a religious lens, from a Catholic lens, I suppose we quite often say, don't we? There's something demonic about it. That when this is a Catholic channel, and most of our viewers will be Christian, and understand that perversion, that taking of something true and perverting it, has the fingerprints of the enemy all over it. And I think it's something that Christians need to stand up and resist. I think, and how we resist, I'm not suggesting going into criminal activity to resist it, but we certainly have to be forthright and stand up and resist this tyranny that is creeping ever closer and will infringe our freedoms ever more.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I wish we had time to talk about the 2 trees in the Garden of Eden, because I think the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is one of the great sources of pretty much, well, every strife going. You can trace it back to that, because what it does, it messes with truth. The dangerous thing about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that it contains an awful lot of objective truth. The trouble is, not all of it's objective truth. Some of it is absolutely perverted and wrong, half true, over true, and that's the danger of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's sometimes right, but it's sometimes wrong.
I'm so glad. I know, Gavin, you probably will be as well, that Harry, that you spoke about original sin. I think that's part of the problem, is we have a completely false anthropology about who we are as people, and until we can grapple with the fact that we're fallen creatures, all of us, whatever our race, what we're all sinners. It's not man against man. It's, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line of good and evil runs down each one of us, not between us as identity groups.
That's right. And let's face it, we are tribal. As a species, we are tribal. You just have to look at the tribes of Israel, for instance. One tribe hated the other tribe in the same way that Leeds United hate Manchester United. We are simply tribal. And what you have to do, if you're a national leader, you need to manage the tribalism, not try and eradicate it or pretend it doesn't exist. I got into an awful lot of trouble a few years ago by tweeting the hashtag tag "Say Yes to Hate." People on my own side thought I'd gone completely stark raving bonkers. Well, I said, well, hold on a minute. Let's just hold on a minute. Let's start off with the definition of hate as set out by the College of Policing. And hate is defined as ill will, dislike, antagonism. Well, hold on a minute. I can have ill will to whoever I want. That's a personal matter. I can dislike whoever I want. Again, that's a personal matter. But antagonism, we're saying that something is hateful if it's antagonistic. Well, just hold on a merry minute here, because our entire society is built on antagonism. Let's take our judiciary. Our judiciary is built on a principle of antagonism. We have the defence and we have the prosecution. They are antagonistic to one another. That's the way it should be. That's how we get justice. the majority of the time. When you look at our parliament, we have antagonism there. We have the government benches and we have the opposition benches, and they are separated at a purposeful distance of 2 sword lengths. Why? Because we understand that there is antagonism and that there is hostility, and that antagonism and hostility cannot be eradicated. It needs to be managed. So put a safe space between the 2 warring options and have a guy sat on a wall sack who'll now and again shout order, order, and you manage the tribal antagonism. The second you try and re-engineer human beings to be something that they fundamentally are not, you end up in all kinds of trouble. Lenin found this. Stalin found this. Mao found this. Pot found this. Every government that has tried to foist upon its people a form of be kind, be good, we're all in this together, suddenly finds that there is a degree of tribalism that rises up against it. And rather than adopting that, what you tend to do is try to erase it. That's what Mao did. That's what Stalin did. And this, unfortunately, is what Sir Keir Starmer is trying to do, not in a genocidal way, but in a much more sophisticated way. He denounces critics. Well, first of all, he others the critics. He says, this is not what Britain is like. Well, actually, part of Britain is like this. So that's the first problem. He others people. Then he criminalizes them by saying the expression of your view is criminal and we will hunt you down. What's next? Well, next is a form of the gulag. That's the way it goes. You other people, you criminalize people, you gulag people. That is the way of dictatorship. Now, I've been incredibly disappointed and shocked and alarmed by a statement by Sir Mark Rowley this afternoon. He's come out and he's the lead, he's the number 1 officer in the country. He's come out and said quite publicly that those people, those influential groups who are saying that there is 2-tier policing in this country should themselves be subject to criminal investigation. That's people like me. People like me who are insisting that there is 2-tier policing, and there has been 2-tier policing for many years now. So Mark Rowley wishes to have us criminalised. That is one heck of an escalation. It should terrify everybody.
It certainly should, yeah. This idea of equality as sameness is part of the problem. And you spoke there about Stalin and these communist regimes that want to kind of level everything. And it's not taking into account that reality that, we speak often about Thomas Sowell, who's a fantastic economist, who says there are some things you can never eradicate. You just can't. And we have to be able to live with that. The firstborn tends to be more successful than the secondborn. You cannot eradicate where you're born in the family. And instead of telling young people, this is life, work as hard as you can, do the best you can, take advantage of the opportunities that come before you. Instead, we feed them this, life isn't fair because you've got a different skin color to this person, or life isn't, and we create, as you say, this victimhood, and it's frightening. You're giving us now, isn't he, Gavin, this the reality of where this thinking goes and where it's going to end up. And it's simply frightening. And if people can't hear this and think now, if not before, is the time to really, really speak up. I know some very quiet people with traditional views, conservative types who say, listen, Catherine, I agree with what you're saying and what Gavin's saying and Mark and the conversations you're having, but I wouldn't dare say anything. And you think, well, the problem is that too many people think like that. And as long as we sit back and say, well, we wouldn't dare say anything, then it's too easy to erode the freedoms that we've taken for granted.
No, I think you're right, but I do have a fair degree of sympathy with people who are too afraid to speak up. It's a lot easier for me because let's face it, I'm towards the end of my life, not at the beginning of my life. Certainly the end of my working life, rather than the beginning of it. I often take comfort, from the story in the book of Judges about Gideon. And when Gideon was faced with a massive army, the very first thing that he said was to the rank masses of Israelis, said, "Is there anybody here that's afraid?" And all those people who put their hand up said, "Right, you guys can all back off. It's okay. It's okay to be afraid. You guys just back off." Then he said, "Right, who wants to fight?" And he invited everybody down to the river. He said, "Right, let's see you drinking." And those that lapped from the water, there were some of them, and there was those that cupped their hands and drew from the water that way. And Gideon said, "Right, those that lapped from the water, you're not fighting. Those of you that put your hands in the water and cupped the water, you're the ones who are fighting." So I get a lot of comfort for that, because I see myself as definitely one of those people who puts their hand in the water and does it that way. And that's just like, what was it, Gideon's 300? So out of thousands, you're down to just a few hundred who are actually doing fighting. Now, there is a place for the other ones. Those who wanted to fight, but they're just not suited to fighting, what can they do? Well, they can provide some of the logistics services. They can help us in all other manner of ways. And what about the thousands who are just too scared? What can they do? Well, what they can do is they can throw a little bit of money into the tin now and again. They can promote tweets now and again. They can support those of us who were at the very front end fighting. So there is something for all of us to do. I think we just need to understand our place and be as brave as we are able to be. Some of us are blessed with more bravery than others. That's just a fact of life. God, when God made me, he just missed out the theurgy. It's been like that all my life. I've just been afraid of pretty much nothing my entire life. But I know that is not everyone.
Harry, it seems to me we have two tasks. One is diagnosis and the other is strategy. The diagnosis we've been talking about, the problem with the left is that it's a false religion. It pretends to be a philosophy. It pretends to be a political way of life, but it's actually a religion. And one of the ways we know that is that the people it disagrees with, it believes are evil. So we think the people on the left are mistaken, but they demonize us as being evil. And that justifies the othering and the gulag that you quite rightly saw as a strategy. My difficulty is that now they've removed objectivity and truth and have set out their stall, which is to criminalize us for thinking differently. I can't see a way out of this. As a Christian, I know I'm dealing with evil, and I know that prayer is at the heart of it. I've always believed that telling human beings the truth about themselves and about God may set some people free. But the problem is Christians, unlike you, are on the whole afraid, and those who aren't afraid are not willing to pay the price. I've always thought that what we were going to face was the slow but steady ratcheting up of the gulags, because that's what we saw in the Soviet Union. It's what we can see in China. This is spiritually and politically the same thing. It's just coming at us through a slightly different cultural rather than economic route. And I've assumed that for as long as Christians didn't stand up and call it out, we would be trapped by it and punished by it. I still can't see a way out of this politically or philosophically. And my assumption was that things are going to get worse under this growing gulagization of a totalitarian regime until Islam confronts it. Because my expectation is that the only thing that will confront it is force, and Islam is willing to exercise force in a way that Christians aren't. So I'm expecting that the next 5 years will lead to increasing criminalization of the conscience, the increasing criminalization of Christians, and that it might get stopped when Islam say, actually the socialist writ no longer runs in cities where we want Sharia law. And therefore, the country is likely to be divided between Sharia-compliant cities and non-Sharia-compliant cities. And the people who are being squeezed out at the moment are going to be the Christians. And one of the things I think I want to do is to create as much fuss as I can before that moment of political apartheid, that Lebanization of the UK, in order to see if there are any areas that can be retained by those who want to think and act and live as Christians. And I'm rather pleased at the riots that are taking place at the moment, because I've always thought, but for a particular reason, not because I like rioting. Rioting is appalling. Violence is unwelcome. But the view I've taken is that the longer it takes for society to break down, the weaker the Christians are going to become. And that at least there's just the possibility, if the demarcation lines are being withdrawn now, that we might be able to stand in the middle and say something about the truth about human nature, in order to slow down the gulagization and to offer an alternative religious view to Islam. How do you see the next few years turning out, given the trajectory you've described up till now, which doesn't seem to me to have an escape route?
Right. That's really interesting. I think there's two things here. One, the truth always sets free, always. So I think it's incumbent upon Christians to speak the truth. And the truth is the truth. It doesn't matter whether it's a religious truth or whether it's a truth about at what temperature a kettle boils. Truth is truth. That's a simple fact. The other thing is this: so the enemy always goes too far. The enemy always overreaches, and therein it sows the seeds of its own destruction. Let's have a look at the life of Jesus just for 1 second. Jesus was barnstorming around the area, okay, and he clearly made a lot of enemies. Now, what they could have done, they could have given him the early John the Baptist treatment and simply locked him up. That would have been it. They'd have neutralized the voice, locked him up, and that would have been that. But no, that wasn't enough for them. What they had to do was crucify him. And in crucifying Christ, they planted the seed for their own defeat and for our success. If they'd not crucified him, we wouldn't have had a resurrection. So the enemy always goes too far. We've seen this with Stonewall, for instance. Not content with getting equal rights for gay people, which, from a secular point of view, that's absolutely fine. I have no trouble with that in the slightest. They then thought, oh, we've now won everything that we set out to achieve. What can we do to keep the gravy train going? I know. Let's invent a whole new group of people who are oppressed and start adding spaghetti letters onto the end of LGB. I mean, it's a fantastic business model, because the second you're in danger of succeeding, you just invent another letter. And so the fight goes on and on and on. But unfortunately, what it does, it makes them look absolutely ridiculous. We can see it right now with the Olympics, where if you can't tell what a man is from a woman in the boxing, you end up cheering on a male who is punching a woman in the face. And people react very, very badly to that. So they always go too far, Gavin. That's where I gain some comfort. They always go too far. Now, in the immediate future, I think things are looking incredibly grim. The two-tier policing crackdown of Sir Mark Rowley, the demonising of entire swathes of the population by Sir Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper, the defranchising of people's opinion that's been going on for years. All of this is a recipe for disaster. The number one thing that a government needs to do, it needs to not only make its people safe, but make its people feel safe. And when we've had unfettered immigration, when we've got the greatest navy in the world, or at least had, but we couldn't even police our own borders to prevent people coming in. People of fighting age, people who we don't know who they are, we claim that we couldn't stop them coming in. Then the government have let the people down. Now, it may be that people's fears are unrealistic, but nevertheless, they are fears. They have genuine fears about uncontrolled immigration. And you cannot be the government and say, your fears are not my concern. Your fears don't count. Your fears are all based on racism and hatred of the other. Your fears we're going to discount because basically you are Hitler. Once a government does that, it will lose its people. And what will happen is what we're seeing played out on the streets right now. Of course, it gets even worse when those same people absolutely refuse to see the evil intent on the other side. So we can't even talk about Islamic violence. We have to talk about Islamist violence. We never talk about far rightism, do we? As though there's a far right which is actually acceptable, but the atrocities from the far right are they're committed by the far right Islamists. It's messing around language in the hope that people don't notice.
Yeah,
we had
absolutely.
the absurd spectacle just this week where a police officer stood in front of a bunch of balaclavaed Muslims who were all carrying weapons, intent on going to have a riot. And what the officer said to them was, "Excuse me, gentlemen, perhaps you'd like to leave your weapons in the mosque." What? Can you imagine him standing up in front of Tommy Robinson, Katie Price, Katie Price?
Yeah, it's Price. Yeah.
Katie Price.
Isn't it?
Katie Price.
Yeah.
Katie what? Katie Hopkinson.
Hopkins.
Katie Hopkinson.
Yeah, we're both wrong. Who's Katie Price?
Yeah, we're both wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Hopkins.
Standing up in front of Tommy Robinson, a bunch of British flag wavers carried up with weapons, and saying, "I'll tell you what, guys. I know you're going out to riot, but if you wouldn't mind just nipping back to the Wetherspoons and leaving your weaponry there, you can collect it later. On you go." Can you imagine that happening? That would not happen in a million years. It wouldn't happen in a million years. The second you see a England flag and people carrying weapons, what you do is you assume the very worst. You call in backup. You call in the helicopters. You call in the police support units from nearby forces, and you absolutely tool up. But when you see the Muslims doing it, you say, "Just go put your weapons in the mosque, lads, will you? Be good boys." And people notice this. We notice this. We see this happening. And what it does, it infuriates people.
Yeah.
So that's the diagnosis, and I agree with every word of it. I'm not quite clear what our strategy is, because there isn't any way in which Starmer and the left-wing government are going to say, "Oh my goodness, we appear to have lost the support of the people." They never had the support anyway because of the voting figures. But they're not about to give up power. They're not about to be shamed into it. They're not about to change their philosophy. They're going to double down and criminalize their opponents, which is why you're quite right in saying the next stage is a gulag. I'm still not, I mean, one of the things we can do is either say in answer to their slander, "You're far right thugs." No, we're not. But that just involves a shouting match. The other thing we can do is parody them and say, "Yes, we are." And there was a wonderful movement on Twitter with a whole load of rather delicate bourgeois people of friendly face saying, apparently I'm a far-right thug. So that's good parody, but it doesn't change anything. I'm still not clear what the strategy is that is needed to bring down the government, because anything less than bringing down the government isn't going to work.
But Gavin, are you talking about a metaphysical strategy here? Because you and I both listen to Father Ripperger, and you're quite right. When people throw accusations at you and say you're racist, as soon as we say, no, I'm not racist, I promise, because I know black people and I've got friends who, then you start feeding, you sort of give fuel to it. I think what Harry said is brilliant. Look, truth is truth. If we can just speak truth and live not by lies, as Rod Dreher has written about, then I think that's half the strategy, is simply saying, do we not have the courage to speak truth? And I think with the COVID years, one good thing that came out of it is I think people were aware, far more aware of how easily we can be manipulated and controlled. And I think that set something up, lit a fire in people. Now, how that's manifesting if it comes out in riotous and criminal behaviour is not great, but at least I think there's a fire lit, and it has to come out in the right way. But the right way should be to say, no, we can see the lies, the deception, the manipulation, and what we want to see is truth, because the devil does always overplay his hand, just as Harry said. And so as parents, we have to teach our children what's true and say, don't buy these lies. And in schools, we have to say, we're not going to accept this. I think that's what, Harry, I know you said about the different type of people, and some are called to that more than others. But I just feel that it's difficult because on the one hand, you might be asking the question, how do we actually overthrow the government? In which case, Harry can give us some tips on that, perhaps, and we can maybe get together with some pitchforks later. But I think also there's a metaphysical aspect to all of this. And of course, as Christians, the answer is, I said on the other day on a broadcast, maybe if all the people rioting were filling the churches, things might be a bit different. What do you think, Harry?
Yeah, I think back to what the Apostle Paul said, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. And I think the powers and principalities that we're fighting against are the political systems that we have in place right now. In all honesty, I can love even my enemy and wish him well and have a cup of tea with him, Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, whoever. I would do that, whilst at the same time utterly denouncing the structures that they have in place. I think that's what Jesus did. Again, if you look through the Gospels, it's very rare that you see Jesus condemning somebody for sin. What you do is find him absolutely raging against those who use the power structures to use them to oppress the people. He calls them whitewashed sepulchres. He calls them broods of vipers. He uses all kinds of invective against them. Now, when it comes to, I'm not a massive fan of pitchforks, etc. Fortunately, in this country, we have a maximum parliamentary time of 5 years. But by about year 3, Labour MPs will start getting nervous about getting re-elected. So I think what we need to do is we need to be smart and we need to capitalise on the absolute thorough mess that Starmer, Cooper, and the rest of them are making at the moment. And I also think that we need to have a few more martyrs of truth, where we go, you know what, in this country we still have a separation of powers. Our judiciary is separate from our government, is separate from the police, is separate from the judiciary. And we need to do, what I did, and end up in court. Now, the problem about going to court is that it's unpredictable. But if you were on the side of truth, even if you lose, you can win. Because you either win with a straight win, as I did, or you can win in the way that some others have done, where they technically lose, what they show and bring to the minds of the populace, the utter evil and depraved arguments of the other side. So even then, eventually you win. But I think, again, it takes having nerves of steel. It takes having real faith that this life is not all that it is. Because if this life is all it is, why would you want to waste it? Potentially being a martyr and going through all that. But if you believe, as I do, that we're put on this earth for a purpose, and it makes me far more inclined to lose a few years in pursuit of truth, because in the hope that that we'll be remembered for what we did, in the same way that people of old, people of past generations who gave up so much in order to secure the freedoms that we have today. I think that's just the cost of life, really. And again, I can't help but think of Jesus. Whoever will be first has got to be last. Unless you're prepared to lose your life for my sake, you can't be my disciple. These are some very, very hard truths that are written down in the gospel, and I tend to apply gospel truths in exactly the same way that I apply truths of driving a vehicle. I have full faith that if I press the correct button or the correct pedal, then the outcome will be overall good. And I tend to treat biblical truth in exactly the same way.
Yeah, I like that. The hard sayings of Jesus have been overlooked for the hippie dancing around Galilee. So I think, for Christians to recognise, I've got as my pinned tweet, God is a lover, not a warrior, right? No, God is a lover who is a warrior. The question fails to understand what love is. Love is at war with all love's enemies. Love fights. So it's a misunderstanding of Jesus. And then And then as Christians, we get this thrown at us all the time, and we get comments, aren't you Christians? You know, we either get, you're wimpy Christians, you need to be like the Muslims, or you call yourselves Christians and you're not soft enough. So we've managed to upset people on both sides, haven't we, Gavin?
Well, absolutely good. Because anybody who has any understanding of the Bible, I mean, you look at some of those Old Testament prophets. These are not people that you would like to have round for a barbecue very often. Isaiah was a poetic nutter. Jeremiah was a manic depressive, and Ezekiel was just downright crazy. But these are all people who God entrusted to speak the word of God into very, very difficult circumstances. They're not the people that are lovely, cuddly, and friendly, are they? And that is the problem that we have with the church. Certainly, the on the Protestant side, the head of the Church of England, Archbishop Welby. I mean, the man is an absolute wet lettuce, a complete and utter wet lettuce. He's doing more to secure the faith of Islam than he is to secure the faith of Christians in his own goddamn church. It's absolutely, utterly outrageous. I'm not well enough up on what the Holy Father is saying at the moment. I don't know. Maybe you can enlighten me. Are your bishops and archbishops and Pope a little bit more proactive in these areas?
Should we let that one roll, Gav? we have a
program.
Yeah, it would require another program. We do, unfortunately, he is our Holy Father, but he is not speaking up. I think one of the things we often say on this program is we don't desperately. We love our job. We love meeting together and discussing things. But actually, if our bishops, if our priests were able to speak up more in the public space and stand up against some of these things, that's what's needed. One person I would like to direct people to is Pope Benedict XVI, who wrote so many fantastic writings, but in particular regarding all of the things we've spoken about today. He wrote a 3-volume Jesus of Nazareth, and in volume 1 he deals with the temptations of Christ, and he actually deals with this very issue when he talks about the people's looking at Barabbas, who is set up as almost as an alter ego to Jesus, and this temptation to say, if you were God, wouldn't you heal world hunger? Wouldn't you, this Judas thing of washing our Lord's feet and saying, couldn't that money be given to the poor? So he looks at all those temptations that we as humans have to throw us off the right order, the right hierarchy with God at the top, and to try and elevate ourselves. And actually, I think that's at the root of a lot of the problems we have now, is the elevation of man and trying to sort out our own problems and not having the humility to say, actually, we're created beings and we need to look upwards instead of constantly horizontal. That's where all the critical theory and the identity politics comes in. So if you haven't yet, I would say to our viewers, do check out Pope Benedict XVI's Jesus of Nazareth. As for Pope Francis, he's that's perhaps for another time. But Gav,
it's for another time.
Yeah.
Sorry, I sound like I'm a Protestant, who's got in here and is stirring the pot. I didn't mean to. I was genuinely interested because I just didn't know.
No, it's fine. No, not at all. Not at all that. I just thought you couldn't mention Welby without Gavin jumping in. So I was surprised he didn't jump up.
Well, because wet lettuces only have a limited appeal. But I think what Harry's saying is that, and quite rightly, is that this is an extension of how the truth functions. The church has got to tell the truth, and it's certainly the duty of its ordained leaders to do it. They've been falling down on the job. And that's one of the reasons why the three of us are doing what we're doing in the public space. Harry, I agree with you completely, of course. I think the metaphysical response must be prayer, penance, and truth-telling. I'm still not quite clear how that's going to shake the political sphere to diminish the level of control that the false religion will increasingly ratchet up against us. You're quite right. As we tell the truth, some people are going to say, oh, well, we notice the truth, in the same way that, I very much like the way you suggested that the Olympics have gone too far because ordinary people can't bear to see a man hit a woman. And it's that response of people made in the image of God that we're reaching out to when we tell the truth. Whether that's enough in the face of a government that I think is determined to be totalitarian and will get there much more quickly than we expected, I don't know. So, but maybe we don't know. All we can do is tell the truth in the public sphere to as many people as we can, as clearly as we can, as faithfully as we can, and then the rest is up to God.
Yeah, and absolutely be prepared to take the consequences of that truth telling. I mean, it's very interesting if you listen to Jonathan Sumption's BBC lectures from Reith lectures from a few years ago. He talks about the role of law breaking, and that law breaking is it's actually an acceptable practice in a democratic society, providing you're prepared to pay the cost of that law breaking.
Right.
What you don't want to do is break the law and then run away from it. And this is where I think Tommy Robinson has got it wrong. It was fine him playing the film in Trafalgar Square the other day, but then he should have turned up in court, in my opinion, on Monday morning and faced the consequences. I quite like Tommy. I know Tommy, but if he'd have asked me, I'd have said, no, you break the law knowing you're breaking the law, and then you stay here and you face the consequences. That's what I think that we should do. I think that's what we do. I don't see Jesus running away from accusations. I see him facing them up, and I think that's what we should do.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant observation. Thanks for that, Harry. It's breaking the law that you can see goes against divine law and natural law, because human law should always be coherent and consistent with the natural law. And in fact, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights began in that way, but it has expanded and expanded. So it's no longer about recognising our natural rights, but including those that are not obviously natural or given. So I think you're right. And I was going to say the same thing. Whether I'm brave enough or not is another question. But I think, Gavin, the answer to your question is that we have to speak the truth, and we have to be prepared at the end of the day to be martyrs. The blood of the martyrs are the seeds of the church. And I can't see that there's any other answer, to be honest with you. I hope it doesn't come to that. But I think standing in truth, standing for what we know to be right, and when the human law becomes unjust and errs from the natural and the divine law, then I think, what can we do but that, really?
Well, it will come to that. I mean, first of all, they'll try and silence us.
Always full of hope, Gav.
Well, it's my hope is theological. It's not political. It will come to that because they will. First of all, they'll try and silence us, which is why they're so outraged by Elon Musk. Then, as Harry quite rightly said, they'll criminalize us. The next thing is that they gulag us, and as Jordan Peterson has said, the next thing they do is they kill you. So it's only a matter of which one of those segments of response we fall into. I'm very much hoping they'll take their time about silencing and criminalizing me, but they may set about doing it faster than I expect.
Yeah, it's all right for you, Gav. You've got a few years on me.
Well, as Harry said, he and I are just. It's just a matter of whether we die of natural causes, or whether we're martyred. Flip of a coin, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, exactly. Let's continue to pray and strive for holiness. And I think sometimes we're very quick to point the finger. Behind a lot of this stuff is pointing the finger and blaming and victim mentality. So let's say, at least as we always do, let's strive for holiness in our own lives, seek to grow in courage, and always tell the truth as far as we can, and do our little bit. As Harry said, we all have different gifts. We're all called to do different things. Harry has been given particular charism, which I think certainly Gavin shares, and me and Mark share as well, to speak up and to maybe take the risks that others can't. But maybe that isn't for all of us. But whatever way we can do something to try and stand up for truth and seek to grow in virtue, then let's do it, I say.
I love the way that Harry reached for a medieval Catholic solution. If you're not brave enough to stand in the front line, put your hand in your pocket and throw some pennies in. That's how we built St. Peter's. Great Catholic response, Harry. Love to hear a Baptist get with the plot.
That'll do it. And you never know, it might get you a few years out of purgatory as well. Anyway, we won't go there.
That's right.
Yeah. I'm only kidding. Okay. Well, listen, Harry, we've
I hope you're not.
encroached. No. We've encroached on your time long enough. We're over an hour, but I could talk to you for so much longer, and I feel like we've touched the surface only to some extent. So I hope you'll come back and have a further conversation with us as things develop, as they are bound to do over the next weeks and months. But for now, thank you so much.
One of the things that has been the real regrets or disappointments of this last sort of 5 going on 6 years now is, you know, I'm known to be a Christian, and it's the church are the last people to want to engage, and I think they should be the first people who want to engage. Really, so it thrills me no end when when I'm invited on this. That's when I saw, when you and I first started chatting, I'm like, oh, excellent. Maybe this is a way that I can speak to and encourage the saints, encourage the Christian church, and just get them out of their pews and maybe doing just a little bit more in this culture war. So hopefully I've succeeded.
I think you have encouraged us, Harry, and I'm sure our viewers will say so and get in touch. So thank you for that. Sorry, Gavin, go on.
No, I'm just going to encourage Harry and say, absolutely, you have. Our pagan listenership is very small, so you're mainly speaking to Christians who will be greatly encouraged by the inspiration you've offered. So there's no doubt you've succeeded, and we're very grateful. Thank you.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure.
And it's lovely to stand together as well. So thank you, and we hope you return and talk with us again. But for now, thanks for watching. I'm Catherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.
And this is Harry Miller.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.